Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and two of the most pressing concerns in Jewish life today deal with, first, Iran and its nuclear program, and how the American administration is dealing with the new Rouhani regime and Iran's attempts to convince the West to relax economic sanctions. And the second area of concern continues to be the conclusions of the Pew Report, which seems to be documenting the demise of American Jewry. Simply put, has American Jewish pluralism failed? These are the issues we'll be addressing to our panel that includes Isi Leibler, one of World Jewry's foremost leaders, who is now an outstanding columnist with the Jerusalem Post. And you can subscribe to Isi's weekly columns by Googling Isi Leibler or his column, Candidly Speaking. Rabbi Eric Yoffie, the former head of the Union for Reform Judaism and a columnist who appears in Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, and the Huffington Post. You can also read Eric at ericyoffie.com. Helen Freedman, a major conservative voice on the American Jewish scene, who serves as the executive director of Americans for a Safe Israel. And Rabbi Joshua Hammerman, whose column On One Foot appears in the New York Jewish Week, for which he's also the online Jewish ethicist. And Josh also serves conservative congregation Temple Bethel in Stamford, Connecticut. And Josh is a member of J Street's Rabbinic Cabinet. And I thank all of you for joining me and sitting around this table. Thank you very, very much. So I want to begin with Iran. We saw an initiative sort of driven by Secretary of State John Kerry, who suggested that, in fact, there should be a relaxing of sanctions on Iran in response to what appears to be Rouhani's more conciliatory Iranian position. Ultimately, it was the French who told America and Great Britain they should not agree to this easing of sanctions. And at the moment, as we're taping, the matter is now in flux. But Isi, I want to begin with you because you've come in recently from Israel. I'd love to know, A, what you think personally about where the administration is going, the Obama administration is going on trying to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and how in general Israelis reacted to America's apparent willingness to ease sanctions at this point in time.
I think it's fair to say that most Israelis feel betrayed. And I think that nobody is more devastated by this than our Prime Minister, who I think invested an enormous amount of effort in a number of areas to politically try to find areas to display the fact that the number one priority for us, as far as Israel was concerned, was to stop Iran having a nuclear bomb. And whereas a number of us, in particular, in the event, in view of what's happened in the last few months, had great doubts and skepticism as to whether President Obama would ever deliver on his undertaking to use military force if necessary, we all expected him to at least stand by the sanctions. What we feel is particularly outrageous is the fact that we were told that there would be no surprises. We were told we would be kept informed, and we were given assurances that there would be no easing of sanctions unless there was a clear demonstration, not of an intent, but a demonstration of a movement in that direction. And what we've seen here is not a movement at all. All you have is very, very vague mutterings and mumblings, but there's absolutely no commitment. I see this in no way as doing anything other than appeasing. And I regret to say that those horror stories of making analogies of Neville Chamberlain's sellout at Munich in 1938 has parallels to what a great power and a power in which we Israelis and most of the world look towards for leadership, I believe that they are letting us down by running away from a situation, particularly in view of the fact that the Iranians were not willing to come to the table and negotiate out of a sense of goodwill or out of a sense of love. They were doing it because the sanctions were beginning to bite. And I believe that once you ease off on these sanctions, to put them back, it's a catastrophe. So I'm praying, and that's all I can do is pray, that the French intervention will change things, but I'm not holding my breath. We're very, very concerned.
When you use the word betrayed, did that reflect how you personally feel?
Yes.
Okay. Eric, do you feel any differently?
I'm strongly committed to keeping the sanctions and stiffening the sanctions, as a matter of fact. I think the task of American Jews at this moment is to stand firm. I don't believe there's going to be a military attack from the United States. I don't believe there's going to be a military attack from Israel either. Therefore, the sanctions are particularly important, especially important. My view also is that at this moment, the government of Israel can be more helpful than it has been to American Jews as we face the task of making sure that those sanctions remain in place and, in fact, become tougher than they currently are.
How?
On Tuesday, after an announcement was made about settlement plans, the Prime Minister issued a statement, a very good statement, as far as I was concerned, saying we need to be focused on Iran here. You know, we can't be deterred by these settlement concerns. We have to put this aside. My problem is, for the last 6 to 8 weeks, we've heard nothing but settlement announcements at a time when we need to be focused on Iran, infuriating the Americans, infuriating the Europeans. And then the very next day, after the Prime Minister issued his statement in the Knesset, he said, well, we're going to proceed with more settlement building, and that's what we've been doing, and we're going to do it in the face of international opposition. The Americans care about this. The Europeans care about that. It's making our job harder. If the priority is Iran, then let's focus on Iran, and let's not be deterred by other matters which simply don't have, you know, the same consequence, it seems to me, to the people of Israel and to Jews everywhere.
Helen, any thoughts?
Oh, of course. Obviously, this linkage between Iran and the settlements, I think, is extremely dangerous and misleading. There is no linkage. What goes on inside Israel, and I just came back after a 2-week trip to Israel, my semi-annual mission to Israel with my organization, and we visit the settlements. That's where we spend our time. And we see people who are struggling to hold on to the land, who are farmers, shepherds, who are doing everything in their power to grow their families and so on. They need the housing. They need the growth there. And this preposterous idea that the pressure on Iran will be lesser or greater if the settlements exist or they don't exist, if the growth continues or it doesn't continue. This is so dangerous for the Israelis. I think that we have to separate them completely. What Israel does domestically within its own country for the good of its citizens is one thing. And what goes on the international scene with Iran is something else. And as far as what Kerry is doing, with Obama's pushing, I'm sure, I don't trust Obama one bit. He has already worked behind the scenes as far as sanctions are concerned. He's already done some stuff with the banks and these other matters that have been putting the screws on Iran, and he's been loosening them. The fact that this Rouhani has placed Ahmadinejad, this is just the wolf in sheep's clothing. The rose, you know, Gertrude Stein says, a rose by any other name smells the same. It stinks. This just stinks. And what Obama is doing through Kerry, pushing to stop the settlements, pushing to ease the sanctions on Iran, this is dangerous not just for Israel, but for the world, because the Iranians are pushing forward with, regardless of what we do with or without them, they are pushing forward on their nuclear program. And once they have it, all of us are going to be quaking in our boots.
You get a chance to respond here.
The Prime Minister expressed the case himself, as I indicated. He said that settlement activity, referring in particular to the Ariel proposals, distracts from America's case. The reality is, dealing with sanctions is a matter of politically convincing the Europeans and Americans to take a particular course. The notion that the policies of Israel are irrelevant to that, we might wish that to be the case. But in the realities of the political world, the two happen to be connected. Israel has to decide if Iran is the priority, then act accordingly.
Well, may I just respond to that? That the whole idea that there is a peace process going on now, and that peace can be made with these terrorists who every single day call for Israel's destruction, this is so false and deceptive and misleading. And therefore, to link this kind of falsehood onto something so critically important as the Iran nuclear project is totally misleading. And for us to think that the EU, the UN, the US, and all these people have Israel's interests at heart is absolutely false.
Josh, as you hear the discussion, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think for all parties, it should be, it's Iran stupid, and just stay with Iran and try to de-link from all other issues. And perhaps the peace process needs to be put off for a short time in order to get this resolved. My concern is the volume, and I wish that our leaders of Israel and America would lower the volume at this point. I don't know all the things that have been negotiated. I'm not sure exactly what this deal is. I do agree that sanctions need to be strengthened or at least upheld, but I'm not so sure that that wouldn't be happening here. There seem to be some marginal sanctions, as the Obama administration has called them, that might be relieved in exchange for a freezing of the process wherever their nuclear process is.
Would you
right
favor
now.
that?
I'd have to see it all on paper. I'm not sure. But what I do know is that this is a partial deal. This is not, to compare this to Neville Chamberlain waving his piece of paper, I think is an unfair comparison, because I know Obama is calling this a partial deal, a first step. And the question we all have to ask is, can this all be done in one huge leap? And if the answer is no, but it needs to be one step at a time with very concrete steps being taken to build confidence by the Iranians, with the advantageous position still being held by the West, by Israel and the United States, that's something that should be explored. But
hold on. I want to make sure I understand, because
yes,
Eric says that as far as he's concerned, he would like to see sanctions strengthened. You seem to be saying that you are comfortable with the American administration going step by step, by which that means there would be an interim of lessening or softening of some of the sanctions.
but very, very peripheral, marginal sanctions, perhaps at the most. And I'm not sure. What is being discussed right now apparently doesn't involve, for instance, taking away X amount of centrifuges and lessening the possibility of building the reactor that would allow for plutonium development of a nuclear weapon. All those things would have to happen for Israel to stand pat.
Why would you want any lessening of any sanction if those things don't happen?
I'm not sure that it can happen in one step.
Okay, I want you to, but I want to set the context for you.
I
Okay,
understand.
because here you are, an Israeli, hearing 3 American Jews, all of whom love Israel passionately, but you hear them discussing it from their perspective. I'm interested in 2 reactions. First of all, Josh says the Neville Chamberlain analogy was inappropriate, and number 2, you've heard the dialogue between Helen and Eric. What's your whole sense here?
Let's deal, there's 2 separate issues. The issue about Munich, the statements that were made around this table, in my opinion, amplify what I said, because that was exactly the way Chamberlain put it. Give us a chance, peace in our time, slowly. Don't rush things, don't push them to the edge. My view is you've got a track record with these Iranians and of this man, an unbelievable track record, which is no different than that of the North Koreans. And what we're doing now is paving the way. And once you open that up, it's the beginning of the end. So to my mind, with respect, I feel that what you've said is to reinforce what I said. There are great parallels of Munich. The second issue, I'm one of those that feel that the settlement issue is somewhat of a red herring, but I do agree that at a time like this, red herrings like that should not be allowed to divert from what is an existential threat to Israel. On the other hand, if the United States or any country is going to tell Israel to stop having construction in areas which include those settlement blocks which are invariably going to be part of Israel, and within what I would call the suburbs of Jerusalem themselves, I'm saying this is outrageous, it is interference. There is a case to be made for the issue of settlements in the outlying areas, which, if there should be the kind of peace settlement that people are talking of 2 states, may not fall into the category. That's where the disputed territories come in. But I'm talking about to try to impose upon us a freeze in those areas which are not really disputed territories, which are going to be part of Israel under any circumstances. I think it's unreasonable.
Can I clarify something? I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay.
I don't want any assumption to be made that I'm endorsing the current plan. What I'm saying is that the volume needs to be lowered and that the possibility needs to be in place that it won't happen all in one leap, that it won't happen all in one step. But the most important thing is for the volume to be lowered and to stop talk.
Why?
Because the sanctions, to be effective, require international cooperation. And that requires a sense that everyone is speaking with a level head on that side of the issue. The Iranians right now sound more civil than the Israeli prime minister.
Because they're getting their way. I think the Israeli prime minister is talking about the threat to his country.
Yes.
And he has got to speak up.
He's
and
got
he's
to
got
speak
to
up
say it
within that closed
loudly
room, though.
and soundly. And he has not exaggerated. He has said all along from day one, and he's being distorted, misrepresented. He said all along, if we can solve this by diplomatic means, I'll be much, much happier than any other solution. But if not, let's not back down. And for him to schrei Gewalt, as they say, now is the time to schrei Gewalt. If he doesn't schrei Gewalt now, it may be too late.
But the schrei Gewalt is happening at the expense of the at least appearance of unity that needs to be held up. If
Unity?
the military sanctions...
Unity when they're selling out on us? What unity is there to hang out
The
for?
unity comes from working together to forge a deal
Working
that
together,
all can agree
but they're
on.
working against us at the moment. They're working against their own interests.
Who is the enemy of Israel here?
It is not a question of the enemy. Those that are not willing to stand up and take a lead in preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear threat and are looking for ways and means in which to placate their people and show that they've done their little bit and run away from it all, that to me is appeasement. That is what I talk and make the comparison with Munich, and I stand by it.
Eric?
All right, let me suggest, first of all, as someone who generally agrees on the Iran issue, and again, wants tougher sanctions.
Yes.
But I want to make a political case here why the tone has to be lowered. Why the tone has to be lowered.
Help me understand. What does that mean,
Yes,
tone
I was going
lowered?
to say.
I don't understand it.
Please tell me.
There's a very angry, almost personal nature to the attacks that seem to be coming from Israel's leaders directed towards the president and directed towards the Secretary of State.
You have heard a personal attack?
No, I'm suggesting, first of all, if you read the Israeli press everywhere, and you read the account of the Prime Minister's talk at the GA, let me make the point here. The fact of the matter is, if you want tougher sanctions, we have the reality that Obama's going to be president for 3 years. Kerry's going to be Secretary of State for 3 years. We want allies in Congress to be helpful to us on the sanction issue. If it becomes a partisan issue with the appearance of an anti-Obama thrust to this campaign, then what's going to happen is we're going to lose the Democrats. Now,
Not sure of that.
People like Senator Menendez, for example, and others have been speaking who are good friends of Israel in a very measured way about how they're going to proceed with sanctions despite the president's objections, and do it in such a way that will actually strengthen America's case. That's exactly and precisely what we need. If it appears that the attack from Israel and from Israel's friends have a partisan character, are simply anti-Obama, anti-democratic, then the Democrats in the Senate and in the House are going to
Certainly shouldn't be anti-democrat. I agree with you.
What I don't understand is what you see that suggests that's happening. And I'm just an ordinary American, Jew or not Jew. I'm an ordinary American.
All right. Go ahead.
I have a certain sense of what the administration has been trying to do and what its stand is, and I thought it had taken recently a pretty strong stand against any attempt by Iran to get a nuclear weapon, and was very much pushing sanctions, and would even be willing, as you suggest, to consider ways of strengthening the sanctions. So I, as an American Jew, I was flabbergasted by...
Here you're discussing substance. You and I aren't disagreeing on substance.
So for me, I didn't consider myself being anti-democratic or anti-Obama. I thought the administration in this case made a serious error.
All right, I'm simply saying, look, the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister. He's the leader of the state of
Has
Israel.
he said something against Obama?
He certainly said. I mean, look at the reports on his conversation with Kerry, for example. Exceedingly harsh.
Have you seen
Well,
what
you're
Kerry
talking-
said to us?
you're
Did you see
talking
Kerry
about
told us,
the
"Do you
media."
serious about the peace process?" Forgive me for saying it, because I'm not an American, I'm speaking on this program, but I say it's a chutzpah of an American Secretary of State to tell Israel, are you serious about the peace process? We are not serious about the peace process.
We need democratic support in the Senate and
You
in
won't
the
get it by
Congress.
sucking up
By-
to these
We need
people.
By the way,
democratic
yeah,
support, and we need a language
what price, though?
that addresses the issues.
The question is,
that
at
makes
what-
the substantive case.
At what price?
And does so in an appropriate tone of measured leadership. That's all that I'm saying.
Okay.
That's all that I'm saying.
You're basically saying, though, you think that Israel acted a little bit like a child here.
I'm
Through a
thinking,
tantrum of sorts.
I'm suggesting that the language was not helpful to those of us who politically felt that Israel's case had to be strengthened in Congress, and we're going to have to work with the Secretary of State and a president who are going to be there for a long time.
Okay.
I've spoken to a lot of American
Let's
Jewish
Israel-
leaders, and the ones that I've seen, it's very selective, admittedly, but the ones I've seen all feel that Netanyahu's remarks were more than justified. And if there's a time for a country to speak up and say, we feel let down, it's for him to say so
Look,
now.
we're just dealing with
Izzy's-
issues of tone
Izzy's
here that
well,
I
don't think
are...
I think we're at a crisis situation where we can't be so worried about tone. We can't be so worried about being ladies and gentlemen. Izzy is touching on something critically important. It's urgent that we get this message across. And sometimes, as a parent, as a teacher, as a leader, you sometimes have to raise your voice in order to get people to hear you. The media cannot be relied upon to be reporting things correctly. I think it is very clear that Obama has made statements like, I have Israel's back, but he doesn't have Israel's back. He said that with Iran, all options are on the table. Clearly, all options are not on the table. The military option is absolutely not there. And he is absolutely working to undermine America.
I'm sorry, what makes you think that's true? What I've seen nothing that tells me that the military option is off the
For
table.
America?
Yes,
For
what have you seen?
America? Oh my
What's your
goodness,
evidence?
Because this president turned his back on what happened with his red line on Syria. There was chemical weapons. Remember, he announced the red line. He turned his back on that. It doesn't exist anymore. The attack in Libya, Benghazi, we don't hear anything more about it. It never happened. It was all false television announcements. He is not a reliable person. Even on Obamacare, which we're not talking about, he's busy defending himself. He said, you can keep the plan you have if you want it. And everyone knows now that that's
If
a
American
lie.
Jews talk that way, we're lost. Right. If this becomes a vicious attack on President Obama, we are lost. We will lose Democratic support in Congress. We make it a partisan issue. Israel's survival depends on bipartisan support.
I agree.
Both parties standing behind the
Well,
Jewish state.
when did this
That much
president
we
ever
agree,
make
yeah.
a bipartisan effort? He pushed this Obamacare through without one Republican vote.
Yeah, let's
Wait,
put
wait, wait.
Obamacare at the heart
Okay.
of
The
it.
one thing, the one thing
Where
I
is
strongly
his-
agree
where is his
is that we must
bipartisan
keep
effort?
American bipartisan support.
Absolutely.
All right, so
But there comes a point where you have to draw a line.
Make sure it's substantively oriented,
Accept that.
issue-oriented,
Accept that.
and
I
then that's
think-
fine.
and,
Okay.
and direct. And when we're talking about direct negotiations between America and Israel right now, because it seems like both leaders have been lobbying the respective publics. Netanyahu has come to Congress and lobbied Americans for Israel, which is fine, but also at the GA asked Jews to lobby on behalf of him. I'd rather have him talking to Obama directly. I do want to say, though, I agree. I saw Kerry's his interview on Israeli television, and it was very disturbing to me.
What
that
disturbed you?
That he seemed to be lecturing, and also it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. He was demeaning to the Palestinians. He was suggesting that there could be another intifada if Israel doesn't act very quickly. And I don't think it's the place in public for the American Secretary of State to talk in those tones, in that kind of tone. What I'd love to see is that sort of being pushed to the side for a short time, all the settlement discussion, all of that not happening. It's Iran. Just get onto the Iran area, have America and Israel discuss the
But
matter
there
directly.
are, at the moment, it's possible to walk and chew gum at the same time. There are more than one. There is more than one issue at the moment confronting the world, confronting Israel, and there is, on the one hand, a potential peace process which may go somewhere, may go nowhere. That has an integrity in and of itself. Then there's the Iranian issue. That has an integrity in and of itself. And it seems to me, as I'm trying to understand what really is being talked about here, is it's not that you're so much against the substance of the issue as it is described, but you feel that the tone of discourse, both you and Josh, are suggesting that the tone of discourse is counterproductive to creating some unified American policy vis-a-vis Israel.
That's the first thing that I'm saying. And the second thing that I'm saying is, like it or not, and whether or not it's logically or rationally true, everything is related. The idea that we can separate out one problem and say this has absolutely nothing to do
Even
with the
though it
other,
shouldn't.
even though it
No, no,
shouldn't,
accept
even
that.
though there's no connection.
Right.
That generally speaking is the case. I think it's true for the Europeans as well, who are very important when it comes to Iranian sanctions. Very important. So the issues are related, and we have to address that reality if we want to be concerned about Israel's security and survival.
That's exactly what I think Netanyahu has been doing for the last 2 years.
Namely,
He may have failed in a number of areas, but in other areas he has bent over backwards to try to placate the administration in many areas because of Iran.
I want to ask the table, can you explain to me what you think is behind the Secretary of State's comments both in Israel as it relates to, again, you cited the most, they were infuriating to me. Because, again, you don't go on television and suggest that there's a gun being held to Israel's head in the form of an intifada. At the same time, I don't understand why the American government would have been, at this point in time, so ready to make a concession that did not seem to me to be substantive. Can you explain what do you think, giving them every benefit of the doubt, what was their intention, Eric?
I'm sorry.
What's the
with
intention?
what?
What's the intention? Why would Kerry have said, "This is a good deal. Let's ease sanctions in some limited way, because we have gotten enough back from Rouhani in saying that he was only going to enrich a certain amount of uranium, etc."
Look, I think it's a mistake. So let me be clear. I think it's a mistake. I think that the United States...
I'm asking, how could they have made that mistake?
The United States is going to be very, very reluctant to use military force. I really believe it's essentially off the table. Therefore, the president is going to be very, very anxious to have a deal.
Correct. We agree.
And I think, by the way, again, I think it's essentially off the table for Israel as well. I mean, as an analysis and an observer, that's my take. But the Americans feel, without the military option, they need to somehow resolve this, And I think the president wants to be the hero of this diplomatic process. But I'm deeply concerned. The sanctions are critical now. It's all that's left.
Yes.
It's all that's left.
And they seem to be working.
And they seem to be working.
were
That's
working, yes.
that's the only good news we
Yes.
have here. The only good news is the sanctions seem to be working. This is no time to back off on the sanctions. And I think there'll be support in Congress for that if it's presented appropriately.
They are working, and I was flabbergasted when I heard about this. I don't want to mischaracterize my comments. What I'm saying is they believe, for whatever reason, that a step-by-step approach is the way to go. It's up to the president now to step in front of the world, and particularly in front of the Israelis and the Saudis and those who have the most at stake right here, and convince them. Now that usually is done in direct talks with leaders. And you know, the Bibi Barak arm in arm on the tarmac, all of that stuff had to be, or was supposed to be, more than just fluff. That happened only a few months ago. I'd like to believe that some trust was built up, that it wouldn't just dissolve so quickly. And I am concerned that it is becoming a political, partisan issue. And I really think it's not fruitful to go back and characterize President Obama as having been a betrayer of Israel from the start, as I'm beginning to hear at this table. I think that the sanctions program against Iran has been very effective, and it's in large part because of the coalition building that he has led. So, let's not get into the question of whether he loves Israel, trusts Israel, is an enemy or friend of Israel. Let's move forward with a relationship that they supposedly had cemented and solidified in Jerusalem a few months ago.
Well, this is a false relationship. If Kerry can say to all the leaders that he was trying to persuade to go along with this program, disregard Israel, pay no attention to Israel, don't listen to Israel. What kind of an ally is that? Israel is the first line of defense in the Middle East.
So he said that,
line of defense
and Republican senators came out with that line. Democratic senators were very quiet, so we don't know exactly what he said. We're having secondhand reports of a meeting that probably should have been kept quiet and depoliticized until it goes up the ladder, until some real constructive talk can happen between America and Israel.
Okay. I want to say this to you, and then I want to hear what you have to say.
Right.
Because when Obama did come to Israel,
yes,
you and I spoke.
And
you
I spoke
publicly
highly of him
on Shalom TV.
Yes.
And you were optimistic, and you said, "I want to see where it goes." And you felt that there was a sea change in Obama's attitude. And now the question is: here you're sitting at this table, you feel betrayed. I think you feel betrayed because you believed what you saw when Obama came.
Mark, if you remember what I said that he had made the best statement that any American president at the United Nations had ever made.
Right.
I also said, I don't want to hold my breath as to the future. I hope he remains on that keel. Big difference. I didn't commit myself.
No, you
to
did
it.
not.
But what I want to say to both of my colleagues over here is, you talk about tone. I want to remind you that that's exactly what was being said about Netanyahu when he started the whole Iran debate. And I can tell you one thing, had it not been for his tone then, you would not have had sanctions, you wouldn't have had anything, and the United States would not have even become involved. And I believe that what we should be doing here to make sure that it's not partisan is particularly people, Jewish people who are Zionists from the left, should be the ones, like you, Rabbi Yoffie, speaking up and calling on the government to change its policy, to show that this is not a partisan issue, that this is an issue which concerns you as Americans, people of the world, and as Jews and supporters of Israel.
I don't disagree with that. By the way, I've done that, and,
Yes,
and
exactly.
so have others in my movement.
But unfortunately, I know, Rabbi, you're involved with J Street. And J Street has taken a totally different position.
Let's start with J
That's
Street.
how Mark chose to introduce me. I don't represent J Street, nor do I
Start
have
about
any
J
influence.
Street, then you'll set me off.
In fact,
I don't
J
want to
Street
start.
would probably not be happy with my saying, let's separate the issue of the settlements from this right now and let's not focus on that. So, I totally feel, I agree with all of you that this is disturbing and that Iran is it right now.
But your name is on the rabbinic cabinet.
Oh,
right?
sure, along with hundreds and hundreds of other rabbis.
And you're one of those hundreds.
And I'm very happy to be listed.
Okay. Conclude this section by simply saying this: as somebody who both cares and is aware and writes, What do you predict at the moment? What do you see happening on this Iranian issue as it affects U.S.-Israeli relations and basically the effect of sanctions or not? What do you see happening now?
I'm not overly optimistic. I'm really not. I do think we need to push for sanctions. I think that we can get support in Congress. But overall, given the change in sentiment in Europe and among some of our other world powers, Russia and China and so on, I think there's real reason for deep concern as to what is going to happen about the possibility of an Iranian nuclear weapon. I think it's more likely than not that we're going to see one in the foreseeable future, and I'm deeply distressed about that.
Okay, and same question from an Israeli perspective. What do you see now, Isi?
I think the key is going to be Congress, because Congress can still have some influence. It may not be the veto on the Europeans, but if Congress comes out strong, there's still some hope. Again, I'm not holding my breath, and I think it's an enormous burden on American Jewry and on Friends of Israel in the United States, because this is the first time that I can recollect for a very, very long time where the American Jewish community, particularly as it's heavily democratic supported, is finding itself in a situation where an administration of its liking has really done something which can have awful and awesome consequences, not only on the state of Israel, but on the whole future region and ultimately on the world. And unfortunately, if you look at the Middle East and the policies of the administration in the Middle East, it reflects itself in a sense that this is an administration which, if I want to be critical, and I am being critical and I can be critical, they treat rogue states better than their own allies. They've abandoned their allies and they've behaved in a way that is difficult to understand with countries such as Iran.
This is a test in particular for AIPAC. And I'm a great supporter of AIPAC as well as J Street Rabbinic Cabinet.
I don't know how that works, but it's nice.
I'm Parev, what can I say? I would hope and I would think that there are enough American Jews of influence on all sides of the political spectrum to help bring the parties together to create a unified front, an approach that can be acceptable to Israel and that can move this process along of keeping Iran from nuclear weapons. I think AIPAC will have a lot to do with that. We have precedent here. We have the AWACS sale to the Saudis in about 30 years ago, where the American Jewish community was at odds with the White House, and the Israelis were at odds with the White House. That really was the last time. It's been so long that this will be the ultimate test.
Okay, I will put my 2 cents in here. I feel that the United States people, the American people, do not yet feel threatened by an Iranian nuclear bomb. And as long as it is an Israeli issue, American support will only go so far. I've been saying for a long time what Eric just said. I believe that one day Iran will have a nuclear weapon, and it's only the best we can do is forestall that day for as long as possible, unless something happens to frighten the American people. And at the moment, nobody in the administration is frightening the American people, and they don't feel frightened, and therefore it seems like it's a world away, and many people love Israel.
You're turning it around. Look, there's an isolationist strand that we see in America.
In general, you're saying?
In general.
Yes.
In all kinds of ways, and in both parties, by the way. The Rand
Yes, I
Paul
agree.
phenomenon
Yes.
on the Republican side, very powerful right
Yes,
now.
yes.
Both parties, in some measure, are responding to that. It's a deep concern, and it undergirds much of what we're talking about today.
Okay, and it does not change when it comes to the Iranian nuclear issue.
Look, the ADL just did a survey, and they always try and sort of dress it up and present it as good news. But one of the questions was, what if Israel attacks Iran on its own? Who do you support? So 40% of Americans said they would support Israel. 48% of Americans said we should remain neutral. That's the number, when I looked at that survey, that jumped out at me. That scared the heck out of me.
Yeah.
48% say we remain neutral if there's an Israeli attack on Iran. But the point is that says something about what's happening in America.
On a larger scale.
The reason for this is that the people do not hear that Israel is the little Satan and America is the big Satan. So that once Israel is done away with, God forbid, then they come after America. And it's, as Mark said, until Americans start to feel and understand that, then the results will be in the polls, such as you just gave us.
Okay, I want to change the focus in the little time I have left. Because lo and behold, I want the audience to understand I have a major individual from the Reform movement on my left, a member of the conservative rabbinate on my left. I have two Orthodox Jews on my right, and at the moment the Pew Report comes out and basically says that if you look at where American Jewry is going, the rate of intermarriage is so enormous, the lack of Jewish involvement outside of what they call the religious communities, and there's a question as to what they mean by religious communities, but outside of the religious communities, the American Jewish community is less and less and less involved in Jewish life. If you look at the Pew Report, it seems to say that across the board, roughly 6 out of 10 American Jews are marrying somebody who's not Jewish. And if you eliminate the Orthodox community from that number, it goes up over 70%. 7 out of 10 American Jews who are non-Orthodox are marrying somebody who is not Jewish. And what the study also showed is that for the next generation, the following generation, if 2 Jews are raising a child, the intermarriage rate is only 37%. But in the case of a Jew and a non-Jew raising a child, the intermarriage rate of that family goes up to 83%. And what it also seems to show is that if you look at the patterns of Jewish life between Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, leaving the unaffiliated out of it altogether, what you have is a much greater participation in all aspects of Jewish life among the Orthodox, who only make up 10% of American Jewry. And of the 10%, only 30%, or 3% overall, of American Jewry falls into the modern Orthodox category. But what the Pew Report seems to show is that this dream of American Jewish pluralism, which thrived for a long time, at the moment now seems to be in jeopardy. That it may be that a generation or two out, the only communities that remain strong and vibrant are within the Orthodox umbrella. And so I really wanted to hear Eric, Josh, and Helen, and Isi, who's coming at this obviously from an Israeli perspective, but these are issues you've dealt with in Israel as well, and you're a keen observer of what's going on here because the future of Israel depends to a large extent on the extent to which there is commitment within American Jewry for the state of Israel. I also want to hear what you say, but I'm going to begin with you as the former head of the Reform movement. And, you know, I was thinking maybe as we did this show, I would replay a moment of your fabulous, sort of your farewell speech at the URJ 2 years ago, the biennial, in which you talked very honestly. I told you I thought it was a courageous address by you, where you talked about your own family and how even in your own family there are lessons you have learned and lessons you want your movement, the Reform movement, and non-Orthodox Jewry of both movements, the entire spectrum, to really learn from the model. And so I don't want to put you in a position where you have to defend an institution. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm not here, it's not about Reform Judaism or Conservative Judaism. It's about non-Orthodox Judaism as it developed in the United States in this pluralistic model. To what extent now do you feel Pew is right, Pew is wrong? I don't care. What I really care about is, as I asked you what the future is for the Iranian situation, what do you see now as the sort of the challenge for non-Orthodox Judaism in America? And do you worry that as much as you and I and Josh were committed to creating an exciting, dynamic, vibrant, living Jewish experience in a non-Orthodox setting, Is it something that just doesn't work?
In the first place, I acknowledge all the problems that exist. I'm more optimistic than most. Look, there's a reason why the Torah warns us against counting people, and we're not an army of sociologists. We really aren't. And so, look, our job is to study Torah and do mitzvot. That's our job. And to a large extent, I think we need to focus on that. We're Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. That's what we are. And I think sometimes we can get so caught up in these numbers that we lose focus about what our task is. 35% of Jews in America identify as Reform, 18% identify as conservative, 10% identify as Orthodox. So this notion that Reform and conservative are disappearing, or we're about to be overtaken by the Orthodox.
No, that's silly.
Is
silly.
We're generations and generations away. By the way, I'm not distressed by there being more Orthodox Jews. Let there be more Jews. I couldn't be more happy.
Of course.
I couldn't be more happy.
Of course.
Anyone who looks at these numbers and says, unequivocally, this is wonderful news for the Orthodox, as long as you think through what those numbers said, what's the percentage, as you mentioned, who identify as modern Orthodox? A lot of what we're talking about there is the reality of New York and an ultra-Orthodox community, which is growing at a rapid speed beyond anything we would have anticipated, and is also a community that is isolated from the general population and exceedingly poor. So the notion that this is a cause for grand celebration, I think we have to be careful about that. Affirm Torah, embrace Jewish life. Let's think about all those. We know what we have to do. We know what we have to do. We need to have day schools. We need to have a camping system. We need to have a free preschool system. We need to send kids to Israel. We need to have a stronger youth movement than we've had. Those are the essential elements. If the Orthodox want to show us the way in some respects, fine. In other respects, we'll show them the way. Those are the elements. That's what we need to focus on, and I refuse to be in despair.
Okay. Before I let you go to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
When you were the president of the URJ, you were known to be, and sometimes criticized for being, too concerned about mitzvot, too concerned about Jewish practice and return to tradition. And you came in and revolutionized the way in which the Reform movement was supposed to view itself. And one of the things you stood for was a stronger tie to the essential sense of Torah. And therefore, when you speak, and you speak beautifully, nobody's going to disagree with you. The question is, to what extent has the message you're giving been received enough by Jews outside of New York, incidentally, for whom practice seems to be something of minimal significance? And I'm almost done. You were succeeded by Rick Jacobs, and hopefully I will get to Rick's comments in Israel this past week, which really deserve at least some comment by the four of you. But Rick comes in and says, and everybody comes in and has their own focus. His focus is a little different than yours. And so what he says is, basically, we haven't yet done enough. So let's, for example, revise bar mitzvah. And instead of worrying so much about the service and the Hebrew and whether the kid reads the Torah or not, let's get to the essentials. Let's make a bar mitzvah ceremony that's more grounded in a Jewish sense of gemilut chasadim, or whatever word he wants to use. But as a result, it becomes a more universalistic and a less particular form of Jewish expression. What the Pew Report seems to show is that the further you move away from the core forms of Jewish life, the core commitments of Jewish life in terms of kashrut and Shabbat, and to what extent are you at services, and to what extent are you giving to Jewish charities as opposed to just generic giving, to what extent do you understand the Jewish tradition demands ethical concern in the widest possible way, but it doesn't end there, and without the Jewish particularism, it doesn't work. So everything you've said is beautiful, but it does not address what I wanted you to address as you look at where the movement is going post Eric Yoffie.
Look,
Are you concerned that there will not be enough commitment to the core of Jewish life and that that's what's threatening and that's what Pew says is happening?
Rabbi Jacobs is a great leader and a wonderful rabbi, so let me be clear on that. One of the most dangerous things that's coming out of Pew is the notion that so many people are now not identifying with religious Judaism.
Correct.
That they're ethnically identified, that therefore the course of action for the American Jewish community has to be focusing on ethnic Jews, secular Jews, and that ought to define our priorities. I have written several times now about this, not exactly to great acclaim in certain circles, but I'm very, very clear. That's totally wrong. It's a total misread of the lessons that we need to draw. Judaism survives only through its religious commitments, which isn't to say there's not an ethnic dimension to it and a cultural dimension. There is. There's a peoplehood dimension, very important. But ultimately, we survive as a religious movement. And so therefore, we need to do all that we can do to promote religious commitment in every conceivable way. We obviously haven't been successful enough. The notion that we will then move away from the synagogue and move away from Torah commitments and try and involve people, purely through the secular dimension, I think would be simply disaster. We have to draw the opposite conclusion. That's what I draw from the Pew results.
Before I go to Isi and Helen, what comment do you make, not so much as a conservative rabbi,
Right.
but as a non-Orthodox rabbi?
First of all, I have great faith in Jews who are proud to be Jewish and not being Jewish for reasons of guilt or memory or whatever baggage may have helped others in prior generations hold on to their identities. They're being Jewish out of choice, out of free choice. And in the marketplace of ideas, I have a great faith in the Jewish message. I think we have an incredible message to sell, and it's a message that needs to be sold to those who primarily will not adopt an Orthodox lifestyle, but who will be very welcoming and receptive to many aspects of what it means to be a Jew.
Does the enormously high rate of intermarriage, first among Jews in general who are non-Orthodox, and then the second generation beyond that, to what extent does that give you serious concern?
I do have concern, but not specifically because of the intermarriage rate, which I don't think has increased to any great extent. And the data is being tossed.
It's over 70%. It wasn't over 70% in 2000. The total rate is 58%.
Right. That's the number I'm looking at.
Yes, but that rate is really deceptive.
Well,
because if you take the Orthodox out, you're over 70%. It's between 71 and 78%.
I think
and that is an increase of about 10%.
It is a challenge. There's no question about it. But I also think that the children of those couples are much more receptive to a Jewish message, and proud to be Jews.
Okay. Anybody who watches Shalom TV knows that I am advocating as strongly as I possibly can in as exciting a way as I possibly can how Jewishness can be the most exciting, embracing approach to life and a way of living as a Jew in a non-Orthodox setting. Orthodoxy, I'm thrilled with anybody who wants to be Orthodox Jews, but what I'm concerned about is those Jews who are not Orthodox and making sure they understand how rich Jewish life can be. But I look at Pew, and I worry, Josh, that as time goes on, the extent to which non-Orthodox Judaism will be successful in any significant number, it frightens me. And I want to know whether you see the same thing or whether you look at it differently.
I do look at it differently. I don't see the pure numbers as the most important factor, but I do see an incredible energy and diversity coming out of the American Jewish community right now, to the point where it is having an impact even on Israel, on Jews in Israel. So they're talking about civil marriage in Israel, of course, the Women of the Wall, all the things that I've been working so hard to make happen here are starting to happen there. Whether what happens in 30 or 40 years will be called conservative or Reform Judaism as it is known today, I don't know. But I do believe, and I am sure, that there will be a vibrant American Jewish community then that is not Orthodox.
Okay. Helen?
Yes, I am going to take a different approach. I'm not going to talk about Reform and conservative and Orthodox. I'm going to talk about what has been happening in this country that probably is undermining the whole picture of Judaism, and that is the delegitimization of Israel. I think that what has been happening on the college campuses, the evil messages of those who are opposed to a whole Israel, a Yisrael
How does it
Shlema,
impact the future of American Jewry?
because Jews are becoming embarrassed about belonging to this apartheid state. When young people are bombarded with this kind of negative information about Israel, they retreat.
Okay. So here you are, an Israeli hearing this debate, but more than that, you are a very committed Orthodox Jew, a modern Orthodox Jew. And it's not your place to be critical, that's not what I'm asking. But I want some analysis here. As you hear, especially Eric and Josh, talk about it from a non-Orthodox perspective, and you look at the future of world Jewry and American Jewry being such an intimate, critical part of that, what's your sense?
First of all, let me say, strangely enough, I totally and absolutely agree with Rabbi Yoffie that my concern is not about Orthodox triumphalism, but about the future of the Jewish people, and that what we should all be concerned about is to ensure that the Jewish people remain strong, irrespective of what denomination, even though I am Orthodox. Unfortunately, and I have to be sociological about this, we live in a totally different society than half a century ago. Half a century ago, there were enormous barriers, anti-Semitism and other elements that acted as inhibiting factors towards anti-Semitism. Today it's the in thing for non-Jews to marry Jews and for Jews to marry etc., other than the Orthodox. Why? Because the Orthodox can, as a matter of faith, talk against intermarriage on religious and ideological grounds. Whereas if someone who is not observant or not Orthodox uses those arguments, rightly so, they can be challenged as being racist. This is part of the problem of living and of succeeding. The great success of American Jewry could well be its undoing, because its success in an open society, its achievement of where it has got to, is beginning to swallow itself up. Now, when my colleague here talks about the numbers are growing, boy, if you tell me the numbers are growing and one third of those numbers say, I can be Jewish and believe in Jesus Christ, forgive me, but I think we're living in Planet of the Apes when you use those terms of reference. Because the big tent is a marvelous thing, but when the big tent extends to that, and when the big tent extends to people who consider their Jewishness to be a good sense of humour, and all the other things that came up in this report, it's quite frightening. I think that the most important factor, which is maintaining Jewish life and can continue at least to maintain Jewish life, is Israel. Jewish identity and Israel still remain together. Never mind whether left, right or centre. The fact is today, birthright is an extraordinarily important factor. And I had arguments with Yossi Beilin when he introduced it, because I said, spending all that money for 10 days, are you nuts? Now, in retrospect, he was right on this particular issue.
I did the same thing.
Birthright has had an extraordinary
I liked
impact.
it.
It doesn't save the situation, because you don't change a person's life totally, but it gives an opportunity for a spark. And in my opinion, the Jewish community of the United States will always be there. It's a huge community, but it is a shrinking community. It'll get smaller and smaller, and unfortunately, some of the people we classify as Jews today are no longer, by any stretch of the imagination, Jewish, other than describing themselves as Jews, but they have no idea what it's all about. They don't know what being Jewish is. And even those who are anti-Israel, many of those people in the Jewish community who have joined groups on the far left, I won't describe them, on the far left that have been lobbying against the government of Israel, many of these are people, not that they're gone down the tubes, but they've never had a Jewish education. They don't understand what Judaism is. They don't understand what Israel is, and it's very easy for them to be. Israel is going to be the only factor maintaining the non-Orthodox elements in Jewish life, And I would like to see the conservative movement, which has collapsed, and I see it as a totally collapsed movement, a great tragedy, because it was a centre which kind of kept things together. It has become radicalised in one sense, and in the other sense, it's just as disintegrating. The reform movement, I say, plays an extraordinarily important role, because if there was no reform movement, we would be losing much quicker many of these people. We may still ultimately lose, but there's a chance, because every time anybody that has a Jewish family, you don't know what's going to be the outcome of that Jewish family. It can be a positive one. So I say everybody that's working towards any kind of Jewish identity has to be supported, has to be endorsed, irrespective of where they come from. But pushing uphill, sociologically, there's only one place for truly secular Jews to be able to live, and that's within the ethnic confines of the state of Israel. And Jewish identity in Israel is not a problem, because there are problems, but different problems. Because when you speak the Hebrew language, when you're part of a Jewish state where the Jewish calendar and all the events associated with Jewish history and Jewish life are living and pulsating, even if you're not observant in a traditional manner, you're still no question about you being Jewish.
The four of you are fabulous. You know how much I love having you at this table. You will always have a seat at this table. I will chase you all the time. Eric, thank you so much. Josh, I love you. Helen, thank you so much. Anytime you're from Israel, you must sit in this chair. You really are an outstanding voice on the world Jewish scene. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Mike.
As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to anything you've heard at this round table. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, through life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.